I didn't really know what to think walking into the theater to see this movie, but one thought kept going through my head the entire time. On paper, the concept of this movie seems brilliant. You take the acid trip of a movie like Alice in Wonderland, and you take the unique style of Tim Burton and put those two together, and you should have an absolute brilliant movie. All you need now is execution. I'll get into a little more detail about that in a moment. First, let me give you a brief synopsis of this movie. For those of you who know the story of Alice in Wonderland, you obviously have Alice, the main character of this story. However, for those of you who have seen the classic children's film from the 1960s, this is supposed to be a sequel to that story. We're basically told that Alice is having these reoccurring nightmares and dreams about Wonderland, about how it's in trouble, but her parents keep writing it off as some phase in her life. Cut to 10 years later. Alice is now 19. And like most teenagers in these type of movies, she's rebellious, she doesn't want to conform to society, and then one day when this pasty white guy proposes to her, she just runs off not knowing what to do. But of course when she runs off, she stumbles into the rabbit hole, and the adventure begins. What we come to find out is that Wonderland has basically completely gone awry in Alice's absence. The Queen of Hearts has basically torn everything asunder, and all of the citizens of Wonderland are ruled under an iron fist. So it's the job of Alice, along with a typical crew of characters, to set everything right again. So getting back to the execution of this movie, I've always been a fan of Tim Burton's style, and it did work well with this movie, especially visually. There were scenes in here where I was all but blown away by how beautiful they were. Certain scenes almost look as though they are classic paintings brought to life. The CG is seamless, and if there's one thing I took away from this movie, it was how visually stunning it was. However, while that is a great trait to have, you cannot rely on that alone. I'm sad to say that this movie should not be called Alice in Wonderland. It should be called Mad Hatter in Wonderland. Too much of this movie revolves around the Mad Hatter. He's almost the main character. Now, it's quite obvious why this occurred. When a studio takes the time to cast an A-list actor like Johnny Depp, they obviously want to get him on screen as much as possible, even if he's only in a supporting role. Now, Johnny Depp is good in this movie, but he just strikes me as quirky the entire time. Every time I saw him on screen, I wasn't convinced that he was the Mad Hatter. I just laughed at how silly he looked. And sadly, I think that was one of the main things that took me out of this movie, was how silly some of the human performances were. The actress who performs Alice was quite good, but the rest of the human cast just seems silly. For 90% of this movie, Johnny Depp is acting like a weird combination between Captain Jack Sparrow and Bozo the Clown. Also, Anne Hathaway is doing her best impersonation of Glinda, the Good Witch of the North. Now, all of this being said, was this an entertaining movie? Yes, I believe it was. For kids, this is certainly a good film to see. For adults, it does make you feel a little bit nostalgic of the past Alice in Wonderland. Not a lot, just a little, because the CG is so beautiful, and some of it does remind you of that classic Disney story. And speaking of the story, this movie is supposed to be loosely based around the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass. Now, I've never read that story. I've never read the original Alice in Wonderland, so I can't say what in this movie holds true to the book, or what doesn't, what things they've changed. I can't comment on that. However, I don't think in the books that the Queen of Hearts had a head the size of a f***ing watermelon. And one last thing I will mention before I give my rating to this movie. There is a very strange thing which occurs at the end of this movie. Now, I'm not going to tell you how this movie ends. However, as the movie is ending, Johnny Depp starts breakdancing. Why? Johnny, what the hell are you doing? Tim Burton, what in the hell are you doing? Something tells me this was just some sort of in-joke with the crew and cast. That this is just some sort of inside joke between Tim Burton and Johnny Depp, and only they get it. And that every time they watch this movie, they'll be secretly laughing to themselves, while the rest of us just look at the screen with a dumbfounded look on our face. But again, it's Alice in Wonderland. It's not meant to make sense. So, final rating. For a movie that conceptually could have been brilliant, I was somewhat disappointed in this. While visually the movie is stunning, and while I think little kids are going to be entertained by this, I expected a bit more. The majority of the human performances in this movie just seemed quirky at best, if not odd or almost terrible at times. It's somewhat hard to follow the story throughout the movie, and there were parts that just made no friggin' sense at all, even for it being Alice in Wonderland. Despite all its flaws, this movie was okay. It wasn't great, it wasn't bad, just so-so. I'm going to give Alice in Wonderland 2.5 stars. I'm not shunning this movie, but I'm also not recommending this movie. This is one of those that most of you are just going to have to decide for yourself whether or not you like it. For the visual effects alone, however, if you do want to see it, definitely see it on the big screen, because the visual effects are really cool to watch. But of course, one of the biggest responses to a movie like this is, take some drugs, go back and watch it again, and you may be able to understand it. Then of course that leads down the road of, well, the more drugs you use, the more you may understand the movie. But no one wants that. You do that much drugs, you're going to end up looking like Johnny Depp at the end of this movie. So, take care.